Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to today's event, and apologies for the very slight delay. So today's event is called Building a New Feminist Social Contract for Climate Justice. And it's a parallel event, which is very much along the lines of the priority theme, which is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So this parallel event is our contribution from Christian Aid and some of our incredible partners to build a shared agenda towards COP27 and beyond, and to seize opportunities to further the debate on what a feminist social contract for people and planet should comprise of. We will also suggest some solutions for the adoption of CSW 66 agreed conclusions and identify what we consider to be priorities for achieving gender justice. Last year, Christian Aid started a public conversation on how to reimagine a social contract. This social contract should be feminist and it should be anti-racist. And we have had the privilege to have some incredible speakers. Speakers such as negotiator Farhana Yamin, activists such as Vanessa Nakate, the UK High Commissioner of Bangladesh, who chairs the Climate Vulnerable Countries, and experts such as Avinash Persaud, the Special Advisor to President Mia Mottley from Barbados. And today we also welcome back Ikal Angele, who was part of our event at the COP26. But we're also very sorry that there's a couple of our speakers who couldn't come today, and I think it speaks very much for these pandemic times. So unfortunately, Kavita is ill and she was really apologetic. This isn't the only CSW event she's had to drop out from. So we really do wish Kavita all the best and hope that she gets well soon, and that her little niece, who's also unwell, gets better soon as well. And also, unfortunately, Commissioner Margaret isn't able to join us. We are waiting for another one of our speakers to join, but I think what we're going to do is start, and then Anna Celestial will join us as and when she can. So our speakers today are, we will have our great partner from Femnet, Memory Zonde Kachabawa, on how financing grassroots initiatives led by women and young people can increase effectiveness of climate finance through gender transformative approaches to adaptation and natural resource management. Anna Celestial from APWLD and Kalak Kasan's People's Network for Development in the Philippines on redistributive economic justice and feminist climate solutions in the context of false solutions being propagated to fight climate change in the Asia Pacific. And then finally, we'll have Ikal Angele from Friends of Lake Turkana on how a truly gender just transition to renewable energy can shift power and resources to women, and the risks of the green transition not being just. So we all know that, as everything is, the climate crisis is shaped by power relations. And there's a growing recognition that the climate crisis has been increasingly precipitated by the failure of the meaningful implementations of global agreements and protocols. It has been ignored for decades, in part because of the power of the fossil fuel lobbies and companies that they have used to silence those who have raised concerns. And it disproportionately impacts women and girls and people living in poverty who bear the brunt of environmental and human rights abuses. Despite those in the front line understanding most keenly the impacts on the climate emergency, not just in themselves, but also in future generations, they're often excluded from decision-making tables. In this CSW draft conclusions, it states that the Commission acknowledges that achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls and women's full, equal, effective and meaningful participation and decision-making in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs is essential for sustainable development. The CSW draft agreed conclusions note that the economic and social fallout of the coronavirus disease pandemic has compounded the impacts of the adverse impacts of climate change, environmental degradation and disasters, and has pushed people further behind and into extreme poverty. As we emerge from the crisis of COVID-19 pandemic and start to think about building back differently, I mean, don't you just hate that phrase, building back better? Because I know that we don't want to build a system which never worked for the 99% better, and it certainly never worked for the most marginalized at all. While the pandemic has devastated the lives of many and put back progress and poverty by any measure, it's also opened the opportunity for this conversation and to reimagine how we can live and thrive together. A new world based on justice and flourishing. But how can we build this world and ensure that those perspectives, experiences, and aspirations count in creating what this future could look like? And how can we share our planetary abundance in a way that is not based on the extractivist principles and involves those who are closest to the challenges we face as a planet? Our modern social contracts have developed within patriarchal capitalist societies built on colonial exploitation and unsustainable patterns of growth and consumption. This has normalized poverty, inequality, and the subordination of women, and the erosion of natural resources, and has led to abuses of power, including the rise of vested interests, amidst failures to deliver human rights, address climate change, or protect ecosystems. And of course, women have been systematically excluded from these social contracts. So if we want to build a just and fairer society and really shift power, we have to make sure that women and other marginalized groups are absolutely at the center of this debate, and that they are the people that are starting to articulate and unpack what these social contracts should look like. So what is the social contract, and how can it help us to deliver a transformed world? A social contract is an understanding of the obligations that we owe each other so that we can live together in harmony and build a just society that functions well and shares our resources. Since human society organized itself into communities, these social contracts have existed both formally and informally. There's a degree of contract in every human relationship. If Bishali is my friend and she feels that I'm taking advantage of her good nature, she will feel hurt and our contract will begin to break down. To maintain our relationship, we will have to renegotiate our contract based on honesty, transparency, and fairness. And this is writ large when we are negotiating within communities, with our governments, between countries, or when we engage in multilateral processes to protect our world or reinforce global norms. The Paris Agreement is an example of a contract or a series of contracts negotiated amongst countries that needs agreement by consensus. But this is being undermined by the side deals and bilateral agreements being agreed by the most powerful nations, and often excludes those most impacted by climate, such as the climate vulnerable countries and small island states. And the new emphasis and partnership with the private sector brings a new element of jeopardy into this process. The CSW draft conclusions, a great example of a multilateral, if not social contract, at least contract, urge that member states should, when taking action to implement the Paris Agreement, promote, respect, and consider their respective obligations of human rights, the right to health, the rights of Indigenous people, local communities, migrants, children, people with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, the empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. Today, our speakers want to explore what a genuinely transformative new planetary, feminist, and anti-racist social contract would contain, that shifts power and shows how to build a positive relationship between not only the citizen and the state, but also the relationship between communities, the individual, the planet, and the accountability of big business to deliver a sustainable future for all. And finally, what we owe each other. And to build mutual accountability between peoples, states, business, and nature. So thank you for joining us today and for accompanying us on this journey. And on that, I'm just going to hand straight over to Memory, who's going to explore. So Memory, sorry, going to straight in without giving her her biog. So she's going to be looking at how financing grassroots initiatives by women and young people can create the effectiveness of climate finance through gender transformative approaches to adaptation and natural resource management. Memory is currently the executive director of the African Women's Development and Communication Network. She is also a Pan-African feminist, social justice activist, and a cross-cultural thought leader. And I feel very privileged to share this platform with you today, Memory. It's not the first platform we've shared, and I'm just sorry that today it's not in person. So, Memory.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And I just want to greet everyone from wherever you're connecting from. I think today I think this is one of the most important issues for us to discuss, the social contract. And I like what you said, Fiona, saying a social contract, we need to explore what we owe on each other and how can we also develop and emphasize a social contract, particularly looking at what the world is coming out of and what the world is becoming. But most importantly, the theme for this year's CSW 66, which is looking at issues around climate change and disaster risk management. And we all know that the first responders in most catastrophes, in fact, in almost all catastrophes, where there is disaster or when there is climate change, it is usually the women's rights organizations, women's rights communities, the youth as well. In some cases, they're the only ones who are left to rebuild. I'm reminded by our colleague who comes from an area in Zimbabwe where there was Cyclone Idai, which really devastated parts of Mozambique, Zambia, parts of the Southern Hemisphere and Zimbabwe. And she was telling us that this happened in 2019 before the onset of COVID. And this was due, of course, to issues around climate change. But what is happening is when everything has happened, it's the women who went back, it's the women who are rebuilding houses, it's the women who are bringing together families and communities. But these women are not funded. These women do not constitute an organization that is registered. So the question is, how do we make funding go to the people who actually need them, to the groups who ordinarily will not suit the kind of structure and infrastructure that our current funding models look like? When you look also at issues around climate financing, who is negotiating on issues around climate financing? Does climate financing only preside with the governments, the negotiators? Is this money also going to civil society? Does civil society have a share? Should there not be a social contract that really dismantle the complexities that has been associated with issues around climate financing? Funding that should really go for reparations for the displaced communities, the indigenous people who have lost a lot of their knowledge, the women, the young people whose livelihoods have been devastated by issues around climate change. So I think this is important as we are talking about the new social contract, that we should also look at issues around resourcing for women's rights as very key and also as very core to anything that is transformative. I think if we look even before the COVID pandemic, and also, there's always the layers where it's the pandemic, it's climate change, it's also some economic, collapse or some impact, and women and the youth are the ones who are usually found at the end, who are really much affected and impacted. But when we call for a social contract, when we call for funding, we need funding that is really addressing both the practical as well as the strategic. way before the COVID, Femnet did a paper on funding Africa. And one of the things that we highlighted was that many funding models are short-term, they are project-based, they're crisis-focused, and at the expense of long-term transformative and institutional development. And this really limits the ability and capacity of women's rights organizations to organize, sustain interventions that disrupt systems of power, systems of inequality, and these require long and sustained funding. And the African Women in Development, AWID, they actually have done a lot of paper, and they've also come up to say, where is the funding for women? That most of the funding is not really supporting our women's rights organization. The Generation Equality Forum, we also heard that we had over 100 billion being funded and being pledged and being committed to women's rights organizations. But we are still looking to say, is this new funding or these are commitments which had already been put forward? No, it wasn't 100 billion, it was 40 billion, which was committed at the Generation Equality Forum, but we are still to see whether that will translate to funding and why it's important for that money to really go to women's rights and to young women-led organizations and youth organizations that are organizing right at the grassroots. There's also limited efforts towards funding local, national, and regional actors in the global south without conditions and intermediaries. Bilateral funding is increasingly limited to international or intergovernmental agencies and less to women's rights organizations. And this is in addition to a shrinking political civic space in the region and also increase in religious fundamentalism and harmful conservatism. And also this is evidenced by clawbacks on gender equality and women's rights. We've also seen that most of the funding requires consortium. So there's a thrust for partners to have joint ventures as a new way of funding and having meaningful partnerships. But this always poses a challenge due to the conditionalities and also issues around unequal power relations. There's also a growing trend towards public-private partnership funding models as a new way of resource mobilizations to finance development. However, evidence of increased illicit financial flows and lack of accountability by private sector to women's rights remains a great concern. Private sector philanthropy funding, while these are new aspects, sometimes they lack transparency and sometimes they are driven by personal and profit-oriented agendas and relationships, which often conflict with some of the values of women's rights organizations. But I think just as I end, I think as we move to a new social contract, particularly within the context where we are, it's important to have increased, sustainable, flexible funding. I think this is something that has really been reiterated throughout CSW 66 to ensure that there's multi-year funding, which includes co-support and builds strong institutions and movements that can sustain the work on gender equality and women's rights, and especially on climate action as well. Promoting localization mechanisms that enable funds to go directly to and be managed by women's rights organizations and movements which are at the forefront with the agency and autonomy of setting their own agendas. Supporting institutional capacity building, including issues around finance systems, issues that enable organizations to thrive as a whole, as well as supporting the processes on coalition building, on movement strengthening that allows agility for responding to issues in a timely manner. I think it's important to really have an inclusive movement building, which involves women and girls in all their diversity, to have data on the gaps and make case for finding women's rights available through the different platforms, to explore and to scale up new areas of funding, as well as to advocate for nationals as well as local governments to also support and to fund the work for women's rights organizations as well as youth organizations, and continuously build alliances in the funding ecosystem. I think as we move towards, we're talking about CSW, which is also looking at issues around climate justice, disaster risk. We also need to think of funding towards COP27, as this is where we find most of the women's rights organization, most of the civic space being shrunk, and also most of the funding not going directly for women's rights organizations and youth organizations to organize and to participate equally with no prejudice. Thank you so much. Over to you again, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Memory. And what I took from that was that really strong relationship between power and resources, or ability to access resources. And I think that when we come to the questions afterwards, that's certainly an area that I'll be really interested in exploring, because, you know, since I've been working in women's rights, on women's rights, we've been calling for that multi-year flexible funding, and it still hasn't been necessarily delivered. So let's think about how we can actually make that happen. So thank you so much. So I'd now like to call on our second speaker, Anna Celestial from APWLD and the Kalik-Kasan's People's Network for Development in the Philippines. She's going to be covering redistributive economic justice and feminist climate solutions in the context of false solutions being propagated to fight climate change in the Asia Pacific. Anna is a member of the Programme Organising Committee of the Asia Pacific Forum of Women, Law and Development. She's also a feminist and political activist working with a national environmental organization, Kalik-Kasan, based in the Philippines. So Anna, over to you. And if you wouldn't mind having your camera on, if it's possible, when you're speaking.
Hi, good evening for us here in the Philippines. Good morning, good afternoon. I am Anna. I cannot start my video, unfortunately. I need to have host powers. But okay. Okay, it's great to see you all. I'm happy to be here to present the feminist visions of climate justice from the Asia Pacific. So the Asia Pacific region is home to the largest number of poor people in the world. However, it accounts for 29% of global cumulative emissions, but has suffered the most natural disasters in the last 3 decades. We have floods and storms to take up about 2/3 of recorded disasters. And in 2021 alone, we have over 57 million people affected by climate disasters in the region. And the region also recorded the highest number of displacements in the last decade, reaching about 150 million people as a result of climate-related hazards, including droughts, extreme temperatures, floods, and storms. So as you all know, in a time of pandemic, women are suffering a triple blow. First, from economic hardship because of the economic crisis we're facing. Secondly, from gender-based violence at home, which is increasing during lockdowns. And of course, we also face extreme weather events like droughts and storms because of the climate crisis. At the same time, we have to care for our children at home and our elderly. So here in the Philippines, where I come from, in agricultural communities, whenever a climate disaster strikes, like drought or crop failure, women are left to tend to do dual tasks. So they have to tend to their farms, and they also have to tend to their homes, because men usually look for jobs elsewhere, like in the cities. So it's a double burden as well as an additional occupational hazard for us. When there is drought, they have to travel longer distances to get water. I'm sure it's also a case for a lot of women worldwide. And then in evacuation centers, especially we have typhoons a lot here in the Philippines, women, girls, and even LGBTQI are vulnerable to sexual violence and abuse. So there's even an incident in fishing communities when the catch is low. We have a situation called sex for fish, done by women as a last resort to feed their families. So women, as you all know, are particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate change due to the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and access to resources. It's not just a matter of gender. At the same time, the traditional role of women as food providers, caregivers, and protectors of our territories and resources make us very much affected when our food sources and family sources of livelihood are impacted by changes in climate. So us here in the Asia Pacific, with the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, or APWLD, we use what we call the 5Fs as our Feminist Manifesto. It's the Feminist Fossil Fuel Free Future. It's quite a mouthful, but we call it in short 5Fs. So it's our vision to ensure a gender just economic, political, and social relationships in a world that is free from climate injustice. So what does that mean? So first, we call for women to be in the center of decision making. We want to place gender equitable participatory democracy at the core of the 5Fs. We know that when women are collectively involved in decision making, decisions tend to result in more community and environmentally positive decisions. So we should highlight the unrecognized work already being done by women all over the world to address the climate change. At the community level, we see women farmers championing agroecology, alternative and sustainable ways of getting energy and water that is sustainable and causing minimal harm for the communities. Women are also leading our communities in opposing environmentally destructive projects like large-scale mining, large-scale dams, logging, and agro-plantations, despite the great risk to their lives. Many feminists and women, in fact, are actually in the front lines of climate justice movements. So we have to recognize that, and we must push for even more meaningful participation of women in climate-related discussions and policy making at different levels. And then not just women, but we should push for more women with backgrounds working with and supporting communities at the grassroots. This call also means the inclusion of CSOs and grassroots feminist and people's movements from the global south and front lines in global negotiations, which is actually the opposite of what we saw in Glasgow and what appears will happen in Egypt in the upcoming COP. So we also call for ensuring gender responsive policy and budgeting to promote women's human rights and gender equality and create an enabling environment for grassroots women to demand accountability at all levels. So that's number one, the placing gender equitable participatory democracy at the core of the 5Fs. So number two, our Feminist Manifesto calls on implementing deep and drastic emissions cuts and an end to false climate solutions. So what does that mean? We need deep and drastic emissions cut, as we have seen in the Glasgow COP, from top GHG emitters to meet our target of limiting future warming to 1.5 degrees. But we know that Glasgow failed us. So we also have to push for more ambitious cuts from the biggest polluters. At the same time, we have to call to account the false climate solutions that was legitimized in COP26. Our experience from the Kyoto Protocol has shown us that the accommodation of market-based mechanisms have produced little in terms of actual reduction and has served as a convenient excuse to maintain the global order of overproduction by developed countries and PNCs. The false climate solutions of net zero is actually a free pass for mega historical emitters to go on spewing gigatons of greenhouse gases as they offset with so-called fixes that are band-aid solutions that do not really address the roots of the climate crisis. False climate solutions like net zero have been setting the stage for resource grabs and the displacement of local communities and indigenous peoples. These also come hand in hand with militarization, harassment, and the killings of land defenders. Where I come from in the Philippines, just in 2020, we had Tumanduk, indigenous leaders who were killed. 9 of them were killed. 17 were imprisoned. 6 of them were women because they were very vocal against a large-scale dam called the Halaur Dam. They know that it spells the death for their communities and their livelihoods, and the state and the military went after them. So that's the real ground situation with our climate defenders defending their rights in the face of false climate solutions. What we're seeing actually is the promise of clean, renewable, and sustainable energy being hijacked by traditional big business interests who have no or little concern for the rights and well-being of the communities and women affected by their projects. So our call in APWD is real zero, not net zero. Number 3, we call on promoting energy democracy to ensure community and women's rights. We want genuine and just energy transitions and not false climate solutions. Energy democracy prioritizes energy for communities rather than for big extractive and exploitative industries. So we have to uphold community rights to decide about how they want or how we want to use our land and natural resources, and whether they want to use our resources in the community for energy. We have also to recognize the right of access to clean, safe, environmentally, socially, and economically sound energy, in particular for the poorest and marginalized people. Another goal we are pushing is to shift from massive industrial agriculture to sustainable ecosystems. The urgent shift is needed away from the industrial food system, including the industrial livestock farming, towards a localized agroecological based food system in the hands of grassroots women. We know that massive industrial agriculture is one of the top emitters of GHGs worldwide. It is also driving deforestation, land and resource grabs. So agroecological practices, they preserve biodiversity and promote food self-sufficiency. So we should recognize the important role played by rural, peasant, indigenous women in food production through their use of agroecological practices and traditional knowledge. At the same time, we can complement this with science and modern knowledge to ensure food security and self-sufficiency of our families, communities, and nations. Next, one of our 5F principles is also to ensure responsible, equitable, inclusive, and transparent climate financing based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. We all know that the historical and principal responsibilities of developed countries and the private sector for the state of the current climate catastrophe cannot be ignored, particularly in relation to the legacy of colonialism, depletion of the world's resources and the environment, and the generation of emissions that bring us to the brink of our current extinction. We have to reduce GHG emissions, not at the cost of the development and industrialization of developing countries. So developed countries must pay their fair share of climate and ecological debt to poorer developing countries. Climate justice, or its call, requires that industrialized countries compensate for the historical imbalance by supporting countries address the devastating effects of climate change and adapt their comprehensive development efforts to changes in climate and its effects. In terms of climate finance, we have seen how institutions like the World Bank have a track record of financing projects and programs that only push developing countries deeper into debt while ensuring the profitability of extractive and fuel-based industries. So we need more finance flow coming in the form of grants, not loans. Climate loans contribute to the vicious cycle of unsustainable debt burden of many poor countries that are already vulnerable to climate crises. We also need to formally acknowledge loss and damage finance, integrate it into the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC in the form of grants, and that it be readily mobilized as an urgent response to the communities most affected, including women and other minorities. Of course, part of the feminist fossil-free future, we need, or rather, a very important part, is to recognize and challenge the systemic and unequal power structure that we have right now. The fundamental unequal relations are at the root of the climate change issue. It is not a simple matter of different levels of development, but rather the historical fact that the difference in levels of development resulted from exploitation by colonialism and neocolonialism. That's why there is an inordinate distinction right now between development and greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial world and in the poorer countries. As you have seen in Glasgow or even in the previous COP, elected officials and leaders who come from and represent the interests of the elites are the ones who are making big decisions with regard to our climate future. These are the same corporate, finance, and political elites who have for decades plundered and polluted the planet and kept most of the population, especially us from the global south and frontline communities, poor and vulnerable. They have consistently resisted the formulation of new and more binding international agreements to significantly reduce global greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure that they will not lose their profit. So we need to recognize this power structure, the same power structure that concentrates power and money among a few capitalists also legitimizes patriarchy to suppress women's rights and our liberating potential. So as we have seen in many climate movements and actions, our call is system change, not climate change. The change we need is not small change of money, but rather systemic change. So this brings us to the core demand of Asia-Pacific feminists, which is the genuine system change. It means committing and acting towards a radical and urgent transition from extractive, profit-based economies to people-centered models that are just, equitable, gender-sensitive, and locally driven. So to achieve this, we have to have just an equitable transition. This means transition that is unique because it allows us to redesign the society right now in a way that is equitable, just, and sustainable. It is a shift toward addressing inequalities within the dominant neoliberal economic system and recognizing that the transition of the economy must have gender equitable benefits. We want a just transition towards an economy that benefits all, even the most marginalized, and women especially, while wisely utilizing and caring for the nature for future generations. So we have to fight, lastly, we have to fight for the right of the people and the future generations to live in a healthy and balanced ecology, which is a requirement for a progressive and just society. So for us in Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, this is the feminist fossil-free future that we have crafted, and we hope that you can join us in developing this further and in future climate justice movements and actions we have ahead of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was great. And also, I think you answered the question which was put into the chat box, which was, could you quickly repeat the 5 F's, please? So I think I caught feminist fossil-free future. So if that's not correct, let me know. That was great, thank you. And what I really took from that was, well, it was so rich and there was so much in there that it'd be very, very difficult to, and I couldn't do justice to even try and do a synopsis. But what I really pulled from it was that to be feminist really is about making sure that it's women at the grassroots who are already leading, who are recognized for that leadership, and that they need to be part of the conversation and they need to be part of those global processes as well. It's not about amplifying their voices, it's about getting them in there and enabling them to meaningfully participate. So moving swiftly on to ECAL, and I'm sure ECAL that you were hearing from Anna there, also this sort of connection about how big business is really sort of attempting to hijack the renewables agenda as well. Ikal is part from the organisation Friends of Lake Turkana, and she's going to be exploring how a truly gender-just transition to renewable energy can shift power and resources to women, and the risks of the green transition not being just. Ikal was born to an Indigenous pastoralist and is currently pursuing a geography PhD. She was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2012 for her efforts to stop the Jaib 3 Dam project in Lake Turkana in Kenya. So over to you, Ikal.
Thank you, Fiona. To fellow panelists, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joined. When I was listening to Anna and Memory, I kept asking myself, what am I supposed to be speaking about? Because they kind of, wrapped it up and did it so well and did justice to the conversation. But I'll give a personal story to this. As Fiona has indicated, as just mentioned, I got into this struggle. It's an accident. You know how people say I wake up and start planting trees and tree hugging? That was not my story. The pastoralist region, the Turkana Basin, is basically a place where the struggle for water and pasture has been a driver of conflict amongst communities. And so in this particular case, that just the same struggle was what led me to start to understand the relationship between conflict and just resources. Why do people fight? And they were not fighting for a big contract or a big road. It was really the fight for water and pasture. And so when the Ethiopian government, in this case, was building the Gibe 3 Dam, which is a renewable energy project, then I started to find out what was going on. This is the Lake Turkana is really, it is a lake in Kenya, but gets 90% of its waters from the Omo River, which is shared between Kenya and Ethiopia. And through that, started to understand how large projects, so it was not just the fact that it was a hydro dam, it is a huge dam that when built has its impacts on Lake Turkana, Lake Turkana is the largest desert lake, which supports not only the communities who use fishing as a support mechanism to pastoralism, but also the waters of Lake Turkana support the underground water that communities use to survive. So again, if you look at that context, during drought, the support mechanism who suffers the most from the drought, it is the women. The men will go farther sometimes into Uganda to seek for pasture and water, can cross borders seeking for pasture and water. But the women and children who are left behind are the ones who have to really bear the brunt of not only the drought, the famine, but also really the conflict that sometimes comes because of that. Then as you look into, when looking at, recently started the struggle, around the same time started the struggle, looking at the largest wind farm in Kenya. Again, same thing, pastoralist community, largest wind farm in the continent. It's almost the second or third largest in the world. It's pastoralist areas. And a lot of, if you really look at where resources are found, they're found in indigenous and marginalized spaces, marginalized based on the valuation of poverty and wealth. But then if you say it is the poorest place in the world, that is based on a global valuation. But to the local communities, this is a very different, they're not, if you have 50,000 animals, but then it's just that the enabling environment to use this, to use this wealth, this livestock, to better your life is actually disabled by the state. So when you look at it, it's really, this areas that my work really began as a coincidence, fighting for land and pasture, fighting for land and territory of indigenous communities. But as a woman in an area that everybody says is patriarchal, was really bringing the work, people say leading the fight. I think mine was really bringing the collective, being a child of the land. It was my role to really, one, inform people, but also hear from them what they see, what they hear, what they talk about, and try and do the linkages. In the recent past, and it's been very interesting, green energy being a conversation that everyone is focusing on now. But we started to fight it many, many years. And I remember when we were fighting the Gibe 3 Dam, I will not mention the organizations, but there were a lot of international organizations who were against us because they were saying, it's better to fight the fossil fuels and, agree with all renewables. But we've seen what renewables have done in places like Anna's home, Asia and the Pacific. We've seen what Memory is talking about in Pandankua in Southern Africa, the current, series of cyclones. People talk about Idai, but then there were a number of cyclones that hit the area. Again, a region that's been filled with a lot of, dams being built. We see the increase of land dispossessed from indigenous people, and mostly the impacted become the women, because they are left behind because of this really, this big wind and solar farms that are being explored, are being set up across the continent, and it's something that we've sort of been highlighting. So I want to discuss this in three forms. One, the land and territorial aspect, that these projects do not happen in a vacuum. It was interesting to see the legislations both in Norway with the Sami and in Kenya, where the land has been clearly declared that it was illegally acquired. However, in this term of a public good, that we all have to start really asking ourselves, what is a public good? Is energy designed by the state a public good? Most times, even with most of the energy, rural energy, last mile access to energy conversations, going back to the SDGs, this access to energy question, we've got to ask, at what cost? Because we really, we are allowing our governments to say everybody can access energy, but at the cost that a mother has to decide whether to put food on the table or make the lights on, keep the lights on. It's a little bit, it's a no-brainer. The mothers have to think around how they can really feed their children, and sometimes kids will do their homework under the street light. So that aspect of access to energy at the expense of, and most governments say, your land is being taken to provide energy. And in most cases, those communities do not get the same energy. Look at the dam in, what's this called? The Inga Dam in DRC. That is energy being developed, not for the people of the DRC. It is to export energy to the mines, so that it enables an extractive industry to continue developing. And if you look at, and if you listen to NEPAD and all the regional bodies, this is the angle they're looking at: energy and infrastructure growth. This is, again, disruptive to local communities, but mostly if you look at who's running the small rural economies, it is women and children. And how are we looking at this in terms of the energy transition? So land and territory dispossession is happening, and it's not only the land and territory on the physical aspect, it's also the access to water. In this case, a lot of water is also, the access to water is taken away from, is appropriated from the communities. And secondly, social relations that are broken. Because at the point where people are displaced from their homes, then everybody has to find a place to go and survive in. We as African women are actually, really raised based on social relations. If you listen to conversations with mothers, the questions become around where they bury the umbilical cords of their children, something that's very personal to them and has no value to it. So when people talk about dispossession, people talk about this idea of development, but development is by whom, for whom. And how do we define development when the identity and sense of belonging of a people is taken away from them under the guise of development? So that's one of the things. I think it's the issue of consent, and from an indigenous perspective, seeking free, prior, informed consent. And we've got to allow ourselves to unpack this further. There's more and more countries and more advocacy efforts are being pushed to free, prior, informed consultation. And that consultation really, everyone thinks free, prior, informed consent is an international principle. It is on documentation. It is an international principle. But orally, every African indigenous culture in the globe used the free, prior, informed consent, whether it was to access grazing, farming lands, water, marriage, all those things. The aspect of free, prior, informed consent happened because you came, you told people this is what I wanted, you left, and you came back and you sought consent from them until they actually agreed to it. So it is a principle that we need to really embrace and indigenize. When we're talking decolonizing, we talk about indigenizing this concepts to who we are and where we are and where we have been. We can't go any further if we don't understand where we've come from, and it's important to indigenize that concept. The aspect of equity in this discussion of a lot of it. I mean, look at the Shell. Shell has now got a renewable energy company. If we are really transitioning, we are transitioning with everything bad about the fossil sector. And it's going to be extractive, it's going to have human rights violations, it's going to have all those things. And we've got to really say, even if we're slowly working towards that transition, we've got to do it right. Because if we rush in and leave some people behind, then we are allowing, the control of this. And as Fiona said, the COP process was really driven by the multinational companies. And in this aspect, whether we are climate justice activists, we are really pushing for the transition, but we've got to be very careful that the transition is not about extracting from people's lands, knowledge, fully pushing them. But at the end of the day, if the energy processes, if the energy ownership is not in any way a public good, really for what it is, then we lose this. And it goes back to the public aspect. We have really been doing a lot of this sites, whether it is access to water, healthcare, energy. We've lost, especially within the African continent, a lot of, we've dealt with a public problem through a private solution. So whether it is the health sector, after COVID, we noticed that almost every place was a private hospital. The water solutions were private solutions. So we've got to be willing to address the issue of public good, because then a public good allows for participation. When Anna was talking about participatory, if your energy sector is privatized, then there is absolutely no space for participation by the citizens. And so we've got to really start to unpack that and make sure that this dance between politics and the economy, politics and multinationals, does not take over all our sectors. And right now, as it is, our health sectors are taking over, our education sectors, water sectors, energy is halfway there. And if we don't do it, then we will be in a country that we really cannot participate in. And just, I'm picking up on what Memory was talking about in terms of the funding spaces, because the conversations are happening at a very global, very high level, elite angle, yeah. And communities want to be part of this conversation, but they do not want to be forced into a workshop, because all these things are interlinked. As Anna said, it's a system change. The economic issues, the social issues, the cultural issues, the energy development issues, all these things are interlinked to people's lives. And so we really have to think around innovating, being radical in how we organize. Because if we organize the way we've been organizing, nothing's going to change. We are going to speak amongst ourselves and leave out the people who really can push this and bring out new ways of organizing. It is really critical for us to think that. And that cannot be in a project programmed way. We've got to think really outside the box and ask ourselves, what exactly are we changing? Who do we need in this conversation, and how do we do this? Because it is a process. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And the people, the oppressors, in my opinion, are actually organizing in their own way and constantly are able to pick up the phone and call each other. They will meet at the golf clubs. They will meet in all the spaces, but we will meet once a year, CSW, or the next forum. So we've got to think about how do we continuously organize? How do we continuously engage? But how do we make sure that it is not a project or programmed basis where we've got timelines, and I saw Dumi asking a question, that we've got timelines and M&Es, but really we've got to start to take the power that we have and engage from a place of power, not a place of I am waiting for a grant. We've got to be able to say this doesn't work for us and walk away from it or renegotiate it. Because as it is right now, we will keep saying this, but as long as we keep taking the money, then we're not shifting the power. I think it's important for us to not only shift power from, whether it's the global north or global south, but we've also got to shift power to the local communities. The one other issue that I want to raise, even as we think about this, the energy transition, is that all the minerals that are needed for this transition are coming from the global south, whether it is lithium, whether it is bauxite, whether it is aluminium, whether it is coming from the African continent. So as we think about the transition, we've got to ask ourselves, how is the mining and extraction going to happen and still not lose out on land, dispossess communities of their water, increase unpaid labor for children especially, and it really brings out a very vivid picture that I saw in the 2019, just before the COP in 2019, when Greta, bless her soul, is a brilliant, young woman who's pushing this agenda. But when she said we need to, transition very fast, there was a contradictory picture of a a child in the DRC saying, we are trying to mine as fast as we can so that we can meet your transition. So these resources are coming from the continent. And those who are it is the lands, waters, and territories of women producing in the rural areas, in hinterlands, in marginalized communities who will be dispossessed. And how do we ensure that this transition is happening, the extraction and mining that will need to happen? How is it going to happen? And at the same time, who is at the center of that conversation? Because whether we like it or not, this is, that transition cannot happen without the minerals. And the minerals are in the continent, are in the global south. Thank you.
Sorry, just taking a minute to come off mute then. So I could listen to all of you all day. Such incredible contributions. Thank you so much. Just reflecting on what I was hearing there, Ikal, I spent many years working in the Middle East, and one of the things I used to hear about all the time was the NGOization of political culture. And I think that really sort of speaks for this workshop-itis. Let's stick loads of people into a workshop and get some outcomes from the workshop, which usually never go anywhere. So yeah, let's make sure we don't make the mistakes of the past as we build this new future together. I also really heard from you about this need to get back to this idea of public good. We need functioning health systems. We need to own the lands which all of us live on, because it's for the public good. That is what our new social contract is. That's how we need to make sure that we're really sharing those resources properly. So we've already got a few questions, which were absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to start with those questions now. So our first question is from, wait a minute, before I lose it here. Our first question is from Chipo Bangira. Very important points there on flexible funding. Women's rights organisations and networks have been on a shoestring budget because of the complexities around funding. Really looking forward to the how we get there to achieve that. And then Dumi followed up on that with, how can we decolonize funding in an ecosystem that works and thrives in silos, power hierarchies, proximity to whiteness, and narrows impacts through linear monitoring and evaluation indicators? And I think I was hearing a bit of that coming out from what Ika was saying. Climate justice is deeply intersectional, and there's slow progress in addressing vulnerabilities in care, representation, and enablement without weaponizing and co-opting women and girls and their diversity. So I'm going to go to memory to reflect and start to answer on this sort of funding question. And then if others want to come in, please feel free, and we can add to the debate. And if others have got other questions, please do put them into the chat box. They're being filtered through to me, and then I'll be able to share them.
Thank you so much, Fiona. So I will attempt to answer, because I think the how requires collective action. So collective action for us to start decolonizing funding really means that we need to work with both the feminists within the funding, the different funding, philanthropic funding, it will be bilateral funding. We really need to work together in terms of them also putting together different calls which can be really responsive. But I think what's important is for them to really listen to what the feminists, the women's rights, the youth organizations are saying, and also the data which is out there, which is already showing that, I think it's already clear that we're receiving gender. OECD actually published that the amount was less than 1% was actually going to gender and development of all the development funding. And we're still now with the impact of COVID, where we've seen more and more women's rights organizations even shutting down even way before COVID was there. So I think what's important is to really listen in terms of where the money should go and how it should actually go. Another second element is really to build trust. I think it's really important to build trust that, Southern-based organizations, can and are responsible when it comes to funding, even managing grants which are multi-year, which are much bigger, and also to look at the different infrastructure. So what we hear a lot is that most women's rights organizations, they don't want project funding, but if they are funded, their institutions are funding, then they are able to really execute in a way which actually results in the kind of deliverables that are more meaningful and are more sustainable. So I think really pushing for and also demonstrating that there are different framings of funding which can actually be put out there, which can support movements, organic movements. What was happening in Nigeria, for example, you get a multinational that comes with an extractive agenda. You need to organize, like what Ikal was talking about, funding which allows that organizing in a short time, funding that really makes sure that the results are achieved. So I think we really need to work together in terms of really making sure we are being heard in terms of what sort of funding, how do we start decolonizing that funding as well. That is not charity, but it's really to ensure that we are safeguarding and we are also pushing for gender equality, for a sustainable future. So knowing that that can be done collectively and at all levels is important.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Memory. Would Anna or Ikal like to come in on that first question around funding?
I can take a stab. So it's a very interesting question, and we who work in a very remote, mutual friend with Memory says grassroots. Crystal is always laughing at the term grassroots. We say we are there. I think building on what Memory said, I think it's also just allowing ourselves as women, as feminists, as activists in this space to appreciate our different, we're not homogeneous, right? And I think this idea that all women's movements are homogeneous is something that, because we are all fighting towards something, but we may have a difference in how we do it, and allowing ourselves to go through that trust process of unpacking what really needs to get done, what's the, how do we get to this level? And in that, and I guess we've also got, we can say we can learn a lot from Latin America. I feel that Latin America has really been able to push the funding sector, the donor community in a way that addresses their needs. I think it's also investing in understanding and allowing ourselves to understand our needs enough so that we can be able to have that very solid position to bring each other on board, but also to push the agenda. So I think, Memory's done it well, but it's just to add that we've got people in the global South who've done it, the Latin American, colleagues and comrades, and we just need to push, and learn from them also.
Great, thanks, Ikal. And maybe we should move on to our next question. So we got a question from Dumi. I'm trying to sort of, here we go, sorry. We've got, I see land ownership as a key driver of intergenerational healing, food security, nurturing the grounds as the rightful custodians of land, and equitable means of capital, social, economic, and cultural. Cultural and legislative precedents reflects gender disparities. Are there models, elements of reparative restorative measures, interventions to learn from? So I'm going to go to Anna to cover that off first, and then if Ikal and Memory would like to come in afterwards.
Right. So here in the Philippines, we have our own version of the Occupy movement. We have an urban poor organization called Kadamay, who have their own Occupy movement, the Occupy government housing projects that have been left abandoned. And peasant organizations also have their own Occupy movement, where they occupy land that they have tilled for generations, but are titled and owned by big landlords. So they persevere, even if they are being attacked by government forces, they are harassed online, etc. Because they're driven, I think, not by goals, outcomes, and impacts, but by their sense of what is rightfully theirs. I think a large element or key elements to this are their self-organization, and their strong and principled community leadership by their leaders. And it's also important to get allies from different sectors of society, be it women, youth, artists, and even some local government officials. I hope I was able to answer your question, Lumi.
Great, thank you, Anna. Would you color memory like to come in with any response?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's, to me, the one thing that we've seen is this, especially from the global south, is when land became property. And with many, especially most of the women, wherever they are, it's around where access and being able to use the land to produce. When now the struggle and then a resource is found in there is when that struggle, who gets a space on the table to make the decision. So we really are, if we're going to talk about this whole process of decolonizing, it's really starting from there and seeing some of the land reforms are actually pushed by the multinational companies and international financial institutions that, yes, the good side is women being part of the decision makers, but the other side is really where what was collective is more, they say it is communal, but it is actually being individualized, and the processes that we need to see. So again, some lessons that we are learning, and we're seeing some people who, some work within the continent, I think in Southern Africa, really asking, are the land reforms privatizing? Are they dispossessing more? And is it really towards the right direction? So I don't know if I answered your question, but it is starting to also look at that, the political economy of land use, land reforms, redistribution, and some of those things that are actually dispossessing more of the least powerful, and in fact, women in that.
Great. Thanks, Ikal. Memory, do you want to share?
Yes, yes. So I think the issue also, I think Anna and Ikal talked a lot around the issues around land. But I also see that I think there's also that issue that we see a lot of a capitalist agenda, which really forces us to, it links with all the issues around the tax incentives that come in supporting these multinationals over and above, the jurisdiction of the land ownership, which we find in most of the times when women are displaced or communities are displaced due to issues around extractivism as well. So I just also wanted to just add that. And then you also find that when you look at other issues like family law, in terms of property law, most women do not actually own land in most of the issues. So there's always those layers that are always multiple forms of discrimination that really affect the issues around land. But I wanted to also maybe just respond to something around which I saw on competition, in terms of how do we get women-led organizations competing less amongst themselves. And I think for me it's really to push back. I think we are put in a situation where which is a whole decolonial conversation around the scarcity of resources. So we are put into a corner that these are the only resources that are available, and they are only available in this format. And that also pushes us to compete rather than to complement against, to complement each other. And, we really pushed for survival. So you find is who can write much better proposal, what systems do they have in place? In most cases, that is non-existent in most of the cases. So I think it's important to really start putting out what is the reality out there, and really pushing back in terms of being involved in terms of designing some of these funding mechanisms and frameworks way before they are actually put out. I know, like with the Power of Voices, the Netherlands government really went out to ask different civil society in terms of what sort of how should it be structured. It might not have turned out the way we might have wanted, but I think when we talk about shifting power in the whole social contract, it's really shifting power to really ask more and to engage more in terms of what sort of funding and how can that funding really look like, and not thinking from places where most of the funding comes from, but also exploring other multiple avenues of funding. I think Ikal talked about how you get, Shell, for example, now talking about renewable energy. And we find a lot of that. We find a lot of some of the corporates that are doing very harmful, things on the environment, and they talk about social corporate responsibility and only fund a school, with sanitary repairs for one term, or they just build a classroom block, which is not sustainable. It is one of what Anna was talking about, false solutions. So I think we need to also start pushing back and say, if corporates, if private sector is to actually fund and to support the work, then it should also be a work on social. It should be also, they should be funding work, which just won't let them look good in the corporate, but it should be actually responsible in terms of, are they not doing harm to the land? Are they actually being responsible, in a way where if they are funding whatever profits they're getting, they're really funding and supporting, and it's just not something which is just a facade, which we find in most cases. So I think having those discussions, we found maybe a corporate will come in, but instead of them actually compensating the displacement for the land, then they'll say, okay, we'll do this, which is just a once-off, and it's really minimal in terms of addressing any of the structural and systemic issues that needs to be addressed.
That's great, Memory, thank you. And I think one of the things that you touched on there actually has come out of one of the comments, which has been in the chat box as well, which is about the way we're expected to structure our proposals. And one of the comments is that putting the issues and frameworks is great. However, I fear our current approaches might leave out the rich contributions from our Indigenous practices that respond to climate crisis. So maybe are we being too structured and rigid in how we're expecting different women's rights organisations or different groups on the ground to actually input into different processes? But I'm actually going to go back to Sally, who was the person who made that comment, and she put a question into the chat box of, we really need to organise respecting our diversity. Although funding is needed, we should be careful about what agenda is being funded. While we must not only meet once a year at CSW. Thanks, Ikal. So I think that again is, are we being compartmentalised basically and siloed away from each other, so that we're not really sort of organising in those creative ways which Ikal was talking about, and getting outside of those sorts of structures as well. And then a question from Karen. Partnerships are very much in fashion in international context, but this makes huge inequalities between stakeholders that can raise dangers of co-option and tokenism. How do we address that? That's such huge political risk, but also something for us to really sort of work through together. So I'm going to go back to our panel, and I'll start with Anna to ask this question. So partners are very much in fashion in international contexts, but this makes huge inequalities. It's all about power between the stakeholders that raises dangers of co-option and tokenism. How do we address this? So Anna, do you have any reflections that you could share with us on how we can address that? And then we can move on to Ikal and then to memory as well.
I think the first thing we need to do is to expose this. We have to put this forward in order to be able to push back, because we work with a lot of communities and other partners, both locally and abroad, and not all feminists and activists and NGOs are aware of this kind of push or this kind of divide and conquer thing that is going on in terms of funding. So I think in order to push back, we have to expose this. And then we have to work collectively to come up with what our framework for a really socially meaningful transformational finance is.
Sorry, I'm on mute. So thank you. Ikal, do you have any thoughts on that? How not to be, I suppose, hijacked?
No, I mean, sort of one of my guidings as an activist in this space is I need to know you to work with you. And what Memory was talking about, the building trust. I think we invest so much in meeting together just to discuss work, but we just do not allow ourselves to be. We are women, we are children, we are daughters, we are wives, we are partners, we are all those things. And we've got to allow that, because that's the process of whether it is healing, as Dumi was talking about, that's the process of building the partnerships. And the partnerships cannot be about or around a funding process, but it's got to be beyond the funding process. Because when the plans fail, we are together in this. Win or lose, we are together in this. When we are celebrating the wins, when we are crying through some of the heartbreaks, we've got to do it. So I think the whole idea of partnerships has got to be looked at beyond this. But going to what was asked, this is something that we face every time, because again, it goes back to what I said, our cultures around free, prior, informed consent, hence my discussion around partnerships, that you even think around, say, oh, there's this idea, what do you think? So even before the funding comes in, the conversation has got to be around what are you doing, how are you doing it, so that when the idea of a funding or an opportunity comes, that a partnership is being built, it is very organic, as Memory was talking. So we're not structuring it in a way that fits into a particular process. So if we start to build that, and we need to start to build that is intergenerational, again, some of the struggles with the feminist movements around intergenerational issues that would have been addressed if we just allowed ourselves to talk. So it is not, again, with an opportunity or with something else. So if we really start to look at it, and that's why I said, let's look at new spaces, new ways. We have to be radical in the ways. Our mothers were radical in how they met when going to fetch water. Our mothers were radical in how they courted in the days before, social media. So let's be radical in how we think around this and the partnerships we create, and allow ourselves to fail in those partnerships. I think the biggest challenge is we don't allow ourselves to fail in the partnerships that we create. And it is okay to say, I tried a partnership with Anna, it did not work, but it doesn't mean that I don't respect the work that they do. And I think that's very important in the movement.
Great. And I can't help feeling that we're not just going to be building a feminist anti-racist social contract. We need a feminist anti-racist radical social contract, I think, from what we've been hearing today as well. And Memory.
Yeah, and I would add radical and audacious as well, like what we really want to see. Yeah, I think just my contribution on partnership, I think Anna and Ikal said it all, but maybe just to add that I think spaces like CSW, I know with COVID, it hasn't been quite easy, but of course, I think going forward, I think it's important to open those spaces, because it's also in such spaces where you get to hear, you get to interact with what's happening across the world. And I think safeguarding and continuing and having those spaces is really important. So having spaces for us as feminists, which are not restrictive, but also having spaces where we can also interact with the power be, with the policymakers as well. And I think the COP26 was quite a space which, yeah, it really discriminated a lot of those civic voices, and how to open that, especially as it will be even be in Egypt, it's already frightening, of course, thinking whether we'll be able to actively participate. But I think also having partnerships also for me means that pushing for more women to be in leadership and strategic positions. So having partnerships within, I mean, we hear a lot of people saying we are feminist leaders, but are they able to also stand up and say, as part of being your feminist leadership, it means on your delegation, you're going to have 5 or 6 or 50% or 30% of your delegation will have civic voices, who have experts, who have indigenous persons, people with disability, non-binary persons. I'm really saying, if I'm within, I hold this power, and our partnership means that I'm going to create space, I'm going to open up, for you to have your voice. I'm not going to speak as memory, but then I'll allow you to speak, not in a tokenistic way, but just to express, with breaking all those protocols. So I think partnerships, we need to really strengthen our partnerships for people who are in power as well, even amongst ourselves, but also in power. So that means also supporting women, maybe from civil society to go into political action, because I think that also then helps. For some, they might support, for some, they may lose the agenda, but having more people within really, for me, moves and shifts the needle in terms of having those kind of partnerships. Yeah.
I think to finish in partnership is a really nice way to finish, because we are basically as good as our partners are. That's how we should be seeing ourselves. And I certainly see, and I think Christian Aid certainly sees itself as being an organization about shifting resources and shifting power and trying to make sure that we do open those spaces, as people are saying. Before I give over to our contestants or our participants who might want to give sort of 30 seconds just to sort of sum up if they've got a word or a phrase that they'd like to say about the social contract, just to talk people a little bit through what we see as the next part of the process. So this is a public conversation that we've tried to spark. We want to continue that conversation. We will be hosting a feminist convening around the social contract, recognizing that there are amazing initiatives which are already happening out there, like the 5 Fs that we heard about today, like Blueprint, which we are putting forwards. We don't think we're the people that have got all the ideas by any means, and we know that really that possibly our role is to open those spaces and to try and bring these initiatives together, because we will be stronger if we work together, and if we appreciate the diversity and we appreciate the different voices that we can bring into this conversation. We're also Bishali, who is my fantastic colleague and who has put most of the work in today, so I'd really like to thank her and thank Nadia as well, and Kewe, who have been really sort of putting together the text for this today. And Bishali's been talking to a brilliant young graphic artist, so we're also thinking about what could the art piece look like around the social contract as well. And we're commissioning a series of essays. And if you want to write an essay, get in touch with us, really appreciating the fact that there probably is no one social contract. There's probably a series of different principles which we can pull together, which could be shared collectively, but that it's probably going to look slightly different in every context as well. And that's okay. And also, some people probably have got different opinions than me, and that's also okay. So it's about really saying, we're throwing an idea out there, and then what we want people to do is to get engaged, get involved, and start to build out what we think could be this transformed world that we want to live in, and what could be elements of the social contract. And if you don't like the term social contract, that's okay as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for their amazing panelists today. Thank you, everybody who's collectively come with us today as well. And over to our panelists for a quick 30-second blast of new social contract, yes or no? So over to you, Memory.
social contract is the only way. A new social contract is what we need for a transformative future, a future which is not far, but a future which should be now.
Brilliant, thanks so much. And Ikal?
Well, if we are going to have a real social contract that is for the people, by the people, then we've got to be disruptive.
Great. And Anna?
I think I have to just repeat what has already been said. We have to be radical, we have to be outrageous, and we have to be loud if you really want to be heard in our new radical, outrageous social contract. So we really need to work together in order to push this through.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. So we're going to have our loud, feminist, anti-racist, radical, audacious, and outrageous social contract. I'm really looking forward to continue to work with everybody. Please do stay with us on our journey and help us to build this conversation and then create a norm out of all of this and actually shift and change the world. So thank you all so much today. Thank you.